Hello and welcome. My name is Yves Sandfort, VCDX number 203, CEO of the comdivision group, and today I'm going to present to you how to install vCloud Director 8 in a demo environment. Remember, this is not meant to be a full-blown production installation. This is just if you want to have a quick demo environment and how to get the system up and running. Be aware, vCloud Director is currently only available for service providers and not available for the general public to download from VMware. I'm happy to answer your questions, but one question I can't answer to you is if you don't have the download permissions is how to get hold of vCloud Director 8. For that, talk to VMware, but I can't solve that problem for you. Thanks, and now let's get into the installation and the basic setup. We are going to start by making some necessary changes to the SQL server. For this, we need to first of all allow TCP/IP connections to our MS SQL server. This is necessary because we are going to install vCloud Director on a Linux system. In our case, we are going to use Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And for that box to access our SQL server via TCP/IP, we need to allow it to answer on port 1433. You need to do this in several locations. So first of all, the service needs to be enabled. And then for the IP address, in our case, we just want to have that for that specific IP address 172.17.20.10. We want to enable this, and we are also going to overall generically enable that for the other IP. In our case, this box just has 2 IP addresses. And then we click apply, and the system will tell us to ensure that we are going to update and restart the services for this. This is a pretty simple process, but in the past I've seen very often that people forget that and then they wonder why they can't actually create the connection. So what we do next is we go back into SQL Server Management Studio, and we are going to restart the SQL Server state system, which is going to take a bit. One other hint here, in general, you can use a different SQL Server instance as well, but I would always strongly suggest to use the default instance. That's going to make your life much easier. So the first thing we need to create is a new login, but there are 2 ways. You could do that manually here, but also VMware provides you with a script, and that's how we are going to do that. So we select new query to define the query. One of the things I always suggest is to copy and paste the data from the vCloud Director install guide. In general, this is a pretty simple procedure. So we use master, so this basically gives it back to the master system database. And then the first thing we are going to do is we are going to create a new vCloud Director database named vCloud on the primary instance. And for that, we need to define a few basic parameters. One of it is what's going to be the name. Second is going to be the file. By that, we should actually create a folder to put the files in and not actually throw them into the root directory. So that's what we are going to quickly do. Again, this is a demo environment. If this is for a production environment, you most likely have to think about a SQL cluster or something else. And you should definitely work with a SQL DBA to define the proper rule sets for this. Again, this is just for me to have a little demo and practice environment I'm going to use for some other materials in regards to how to use vCloud Director, VRA, and some other stuff in the near future. So we put in the file name, we give it an initial size. Again, all purely for the demo environment we are going to do here. And so give it an initial size. We also have to provide it with the growth information, so if it reaches the maximum size, how quickly and how fast should it grow. And then we should also provide it with the necessary information in regards to where to put the log files on. Again, this needs to get a name. In our case, this is just by the standard procedures according to the vCloud Director Setup Guide. So pretty straightforward process. You can basically copy and paste the files from here. By the way, if you are going to demo this or practice this with an Oracle instance, similar files are available and informations for the Oracle database as well. Finally, we give it the character set we are going to use to set it up with, and then we are going to execute this whole bunch of commands. Pretty straightforward process. In most cases, this should not give us any error. It takes a few seconds, but is rather quick. And then we are going to move on from here and create our initial data. So let's quickly do a rescan here and see where the database has been created. Next, we are going to alter some basic system parameters, and this is going to be, we're going to use vCloud. We're going to alter some basic parameters. Again, this is nothing special. This is just purely based on the overall parameters defined by VMware, and as long as you don't really know what you are doing, it's better to stick with them. And as I said numerous times, is be sure that you validate all of this with your proper SQL DBA before you use this in a full-blown production installation. So again, these are just some basic rule sets. I'm not going to go into them into too much detail each individually. It just actually sets some basic rules. So it defines rollback instances, snapshot parameters, and just some very, very basic rule sets. Again, we are going to execute this one, and then, hang on a second, I did something wrong here somewhere. Let me find, oh. This should have been an underscore. Okay, and as you can see, everything works fine this way. So this brings us to the last step. We now need to finally create the individual user in the system. Finally, we are now going to create the additional user. Basic procedure is again the same. The point here is this is also where you were to define a password. In our case, we will leave all of that pretty simple. Again, this is a demo environment, so we will leave this with a very, very basic password of VMware123 bang. In your environment, you might want to choose something a bit more sophisticated for that. We also define what's going to be the default database. In our case, this is going to be the vCloud database we just created. And we are also going to set some other default parameters like language and other things to ensure that we have the correct character set and everything in place from the minute one. Once the login is created, we create the user account, linked back to that login information. This is just as said for MS SQL Server. You have a login, which is basically defining everything, and then you link the user back to the login. Again, this should not be a SQL Server guideline. Just take these basic values and use them for your environment. Okay, we are going to execute this one as well. And then we have mostly all of the systems created. So the only remaining tasks are to basically link a role to that specific user and login we just created. So we link the DB owner role for the vCloud director database to the user we just created. And this is just, it's always a bit of a hen and egg problem, whether you create the database or the user first. In any way, both of them need to be linked to each other. Good. So as we have done most of that, we now need to actually start by installing some basic libraries. So what I pre-prepared for this is to actually pre-build a Red Hat box, basic standard setup, just TCP IP configuration setup. And then if you look into the vCloud Directory install guide, you will see that there is actually a list of packages which need to be installed on that individual system. And this is basically what I'm going to do here, is to sum up all these packages and do an install command for them, which is going to take a couple of seconds, but it's nothing really extraordinary. If you have dealt with vCloud Director back in the version 1 days or something like that, there were certainly libraries which were not easy to get or not standard procedures. That has changed now, luckily, and makes our life a bit more easier to get all of this installed. Again, there is a complete list in the vCloud Directory install guide. Just stay with that, and that will help you get your system set up properly. By the way, you could also use any kind of or specific CentOS versions are supported nowadays as well. You are no longer bound to really do that. Oh, it's not RPM installs, it's yum install. Sorry for that. So you're no longer bound to use the Red Hat Enterprise version. You can also just go in and use the CentOS system. As I have a cloud license for Red Hat, that's not really a challenge, and I'm going to install that this way. So just download them, and then the next step is to click yes, which will actually go through the system. We are going to go through which will go through the install, and then finally get your system properly prepared for this. It takes now a couple of seconds to go through the process, but again, this is a pretty straightforward process. You just let that run. The system will download the necessary packages, get them up and running. In our case, it identified 26 of them. It depends a bit on what's your base build for your overall system. Nothing big, nothing extraordinary or something like that is within this list of individual files and everything. Good. I'm going to skip a few elements in here just to speed up the process a bit for you. I think you all have seen how to install works. Once this is done, the next step is to then install the vCloud Director binaries, which, as said before, you can download from VMware if you have an active service provider agreement, or you have to talk to VMware what other probably solutions are to get hold of it. I can't help you with that, so that is one of the areas where I would always direct you back to VMware. So, next step, again, there is that binary. We are going to, hang on a second. We need to first make it writable. Pretty simple. And now we are going to execute that command. And this is a pretty straightforward process. So now the system is going to do all the installation pieces on the Linux machine, and that will leave us with a question at the end to run the configuration. We are going to do that in 2 individual steps. So as you can see here, it's going to deploy and install all the individual RPMs into the system. Pretty quick, easy, and straightforward process. And then we are going to run that script at a later point in time in a single. Before we can actually run the configuration, we need to have certificates in place. In our case, we will use the cell management tool to just generate some self-signed keys, which is a pretty straightforward process now with version 8. They have provided a command for that, and that actually gets rid of the old scenario where you had to manually create the cert. So this is going to be put in the folder we wanted, and then we are running configure, provide the IP address for the web service and the remote console proxy. Then we need to show it the certificate. Be sure for the IP addresses above that you have both DNS and reverse DNS set up correctly. Once you have entered the password for the key store, you are also going to enter the syslog server. In our case, that's vrli.mosddc.com. We need to provide it with the SQL Server. We just threw it on the domain controller because this is just, as said, a demo kit, and we have one Windows box in there which has to provide nearly all Windows services, provided with the database name, the user account, and then basically off you go, and the system is going to run through the individual install process from here. Pretty basically standalone. You can see a little progress bar showing up shortly, and that will guide us through it. So once all of that is done, we can basically go ahead and start the vCloud Director service again. This is a Java process, so it takes a couple of seconds or minutes to start up, depending on your overall system environment. And then the next step is going to be to go through step by step the necessary components or steps to get this all up and running in a fine state. So we are going to create the necessary components over the web user interface next. For that, we are going to open a browser, again HTTPS. As it's a self-signed certificate, we need to confirm that first. And once we get into that, we need to actually enter some basic vCloud Director information. So you get to the welcome screen, which guides you through the basic procedure. You basically hit next. You need to confirm the license agreements. And then you have to enter a license key into the system. Next, we need to create the basic administrator user account, give it a password. Again, pretty simple process in our case. We also need to provide it with a full name and an email address, just for demo purposes. Pretty straightforward process, as described before. Once all of this information has been entered into the system, so again, this is for our demo DDC, we can basically go through and confirm it, and then the system will do the configuration. Again, I can't show you the confirmation screen as it would show the system information in regards to license keys, but in this case this at least allows us to quickly go through it. Okay, so once all of that is done, you are going to log in. The account was the one you just created, so we are going to start with administrator. Later on you can link all this back to an LDAP server and leverage LDAP accounts or to log into the system, but for now we are just going to go through a basic login procedure from a normal administrator user account. So once inside the system, you will see that you will get usual procedure screen as we had in the past. First of all, we have to attach it to a vCenter server. In our case, that's our vCenter server appliance in our demo SDDC environment. So we are going to give it the host name, which is going to be vcsa.demosddc.com. And then we are going to provide it with the username and password for it. So as you can see, pretty simple procedure. Username in our case, again, demo environment, administrator at vsphere.local. I would strongly suggest in a real environment that this is a dedicated vCloud Director user account. This helps you to see in events, etc., if something was triggered by vCloud Director or something else, just to be sure that all of this actually makes sense. We also will give it the necessary password, and then finally we are going to give it the vCenter name, which is going to be the representative you will see within vCloud Director later on, as you can have multiple vCenter servers in here. Finally, there is always the link between vCloud Director and vCenter Server. In our case, we want to have the ability to jump into the vSphere web client from here. For that, you need to provide it with the necessary URL. If you were to link it via PSC or SSO to vCloud Director, to vCenter Server, you would have a different situation here because you would get directly all the necessary informations here. It's going to validate that, and it's currently telling me that my credentials are not correct, so I must have a typo somewhere. So it's VCSA, and this is correct, that is correct, and let's fix it over here as well, and down here as well, and then off we go. Hit next again, and this time more luck. Then we need to link it to a vShield manager. In our case, we have an NSX manager deployed and installed in our environment, which we are going to link it against. So that's under the address NSX manager. Let me quickly check the correct address, a01.mosddc.com, provided again with the necessary admin account for that. And hit next, which will validate that information as well. And then you can click finish and you have your basic resource provider available. The next step is to actually create a provider VDC. This is basically the link between a cluster or a specific resource pool or whatever you want to do, and later on the org VDC. So the provider VDC is really more the infrastructure piece. And then with the org VDCs, you are going to carve pieces out of that. In our case, we are going to just call it provider VDC. You define the maximum hardware level for it. And then you basically also have to define which resource pool you are going to use. Our demo environment has a management and resource cluster, so we picked the resource cluster for that. As we haven't defined any storage policies yet, we are going to just stick with the any policy. As you can see here, it's going to pick the local data stores. This is nothing you want to have later on, so you might need to reinvent additional storage policies and profiles here later. You also need to provide it with host credentials so that it can actually go ahead and install the necessary pieces on the ESXi hosts if you were to use VCDNI or other components at a later point in time. Next, we need to create an external network. External network is basically where we link later on organizations against resources. In our cases, we have created a production network, and we are going to define that this is going to be available from vCloud Director. So you link it against the distributed port group, and the next step you are also going to do is you have to provide it with some basic IP pool information. So like what's the gateway? In our case, that's 172.17.20.1, and you need to provide it with next mask. That's the bare minimum. Plus you have to define an IP range for static IPs. As we want to be a bit more, we want to have a bit more possibilities, we also provided with a DNS server and the DNS suffix we have defined in our infrastructure here. So, yep, pool needs to be provided. So in our case, we are going to use whatever we haven't used yet in the HCP pool for the demo environment, so from 101 to 149. Again, this is just a demo kit. We will most likely never deploy more than 40 or 50 VMs in here. So you hit add, you hit OK, now you have an IP pool, you can get rid of the error message, and then we click next and name that external network in our infrastructure. Good. So as you can see, we have the basic cloud infrastructure available. The next is to create an organization or a tenant in our environment. This is basically how we would link resources back to users. In our case, we are going to call that just the demo organization. It needs to get the demo org is basically what we provide in the URL later on. and we need to also provide it with a full name, which is demo organization in our demo SDDC environment. This would be the place where you could actually link it against a custom or a customer-specific LDAP environment. We are going to leave it as is. We are not going to add additional users. If you want to build a full-blown demo environment, you might want to create a definitive catalog org. In our case, we are just going to create that one organization, as we will populate that differently with individual informations. You can also define the policies. How long are things going to be stored here? Again, we want to be sure that in our demo kit nothing expires or gets deleted automatically just because we haven't used the demo kit for a while. So we are going to ramp these policies to be unlimited in time. You can finish, and that's going to create also resource pools, etc. in vSphere, which you can later on then use for resources. So now that we have an organization, we need to define what levels of resources are available for that specific organization. In our case, we can now pick from the provider VDC we created before, and now you have to pick an allocation model. I'm not going to go into too much detail on what these are. We are going to go pay as you go for our demo kit. Again, we don't want to see any reservations or anything, so we are going to make some slight modifications here. If you want to learn more about the different allocation models and everything, there are tons of resources out there on the net. There is also the old vCloud directory install configure manage class from VMware Education, which is still fully valid. In general, from the basic system, there hasn't changed that much. There is a lot of new service provider specific information, which is new, but nothing you need to worry about. Okay, assign it with a storage array. We have to define whether it allows SYN provisioning, and then you are going to also define a network pool which can be used in this scenario. We have a predefined VXLAN pool which comes from the NSX setup. So we can basically use that, define how many networks should be available for within that organization, and then we hit next. We could create an edge gateway as an outside barrier for this organization, and then finally we need to give that organizational VDC a name. This is basically all you have to do to build a very, very basic and easy setup. The advantage if you have something like that in your lab environment, especially for those of you dealing with VRA, this replicates what most vCloud Air service providers are going to provide to you. So this gives you with the URLs and the cloud backend so that you can within your environment create a similar scenario to an external cloud service provider, but just you don't have to use any services or something like that. So, org VDC created, hit finish, and that's it for the moment. Again, thanks for watching. As you can see, everything is done. My name is Yves Sandfort, VCDX number 203, managing for cloud and management. And if you want to reach out to me, you can do so on Twitter at Yves Sandfort is my Twitter handle, or write me an email at y.sandfort@comdivision.com. Thanks for watching and hearing and seeing you soon.